Are they reaching for a cell phone? Are they reaching for a gun?
I will take that extra 11/100ths of a second or something in there to be right versus being fast and wrong.
You are better off tactically, and I know as a lawyer you're better off legally by positioning the firearm at low ready than you are at pointing it at somebody's chest.
This is the In Self-Defense Podcast with Don West, Steve Moses, and Sean Vincent, exploring high-profile self-defense cases and identifying the lessons learned for concealed carriers. Hey everybody, I'm Sean Vincent. Thanks for joining the podcast today. Our special guest is Erick Gelhaus. He had an impressive career in the Army, then in law enforcement. Now he is a firearms and self-defense trainer. We're going to be talking about defensive display. If you've been listening to the podcast, you know that we've been talking about defensive display as a viable alternative to the use of deadly force. There's a way to do it right. There's a way to do it wrong. Defensive display, even though it is not considered the actual use of deadly force, still carries legal jeopardy with it, especially if it's mistaken as brandishing, which can be charged as aggravated assault or some other charge depending upon your jurisdiction. Erick's going to bring some academic studies that show that there are tactical and legal advantages to using a low-ready defensive display position that doesn't, as he says, put muzzle on meat. So it's an interesting conversation. I think it's going to make you a smarter, safer, armed defender. We're joined by Don West, as always. He's National Trial Counsel for CCW Safe. Steve Moses, he's a well-regarded firearms instructor and our friend, and he's always bringing us great guests. You got one of them today. Erick Gelhaus, thanks for joining us. Here's our conversation.
I have known Erick, I think now for probably 5+ years. He's a member of the Firearm Trainers Association, so I interact with him from time to time. I have also attended Erick's lectures at the Rangemaster Tactical Conference, and I was a student in a class in which Erick was an instructor called the Thunderstick Summit, which was a shotgun. It's a summit, and one of the other presenters at that time was Tom Givens. So, you know, I'm kind of around all these giants, so I'm just a kind of another little guy in the crowd, just being a student. And man, I gained so much information. I have so much respect for Erick, and I just thought he would be a great addition to this podcast. I took the liberty of printing off some stuff, so I'll talk a little bit about Erick and then ask him to elaborate. Erick was in law enforcement for about 30 years. He retired from a large California sheriff's office. He worked patrol, use of force firearms program, and let's see what all, gang suppression investigations and field training. He was also their lead instructor, and he is currently, and correct me if I'm wrong, Erick, I believe the lead instructor at Gunsight, which Gunsight is kind of considered the Valhalla for kind of the place where professional firearms instruction started with Colonel Jeff Cooper. Was that back in the 70s, Erick?
Yeah, Colonel Cooper spun up the school in 76. I'm taking a bit of time to work on my business rather than working down there. I was never the lead instructor there, so it's coach or range master. I progressed from coach to range master. I did develop the Red Dot Optics program that they use, and rewrote the student handbook a few years back. But I'm taking some time to work on my business.
Okay, thank you for clarifying that. He also spent 3 years, golly, what was it? You were in all three components of the U.S. Army and saw combat as a heavy weapons squad leader. And among all these other things, he's done a lot of writing. He's done some excellent presentations. I believe you have a master in public administration. Yes. And he's a prolific writer. So this is a real, honor and privilege for me to have him on this podcast. And I look forward to not only being a part of it, but learning a bunch from Erick's participation here.
I'm only a prolific writer because the way it works out is I have to write every week. So that's why it's prolific.
Are you saying you don't necessarily enjoy it, or you're not compelled to write,
Oh,
Eric?
I enjoy it. Just I will say that some offerings are better than others if you have to write every week.
Fair enough. Well, but I don't know. I think if you write that much weekly all the time, it gets better and better, and it becomes natural, doesn't it?
Yeah, one of the benefits of grad school was the ability to sit down and put something coherent out in a short period of time.
Nice. Let's see if we can put something coherent out in the next 40 minutes. Uh, Eric, let me ask you this. Since we have some things we want to talk about today about defensive display in particular, but since you had a career in the military and in law enforcement, and you've been doing training and working with folks in the civilian field, I'd love to know, what do you see out there? Because is it difficult to adapt somebody who has military training to be an armed citizen? Do you see that with law enforcement as well? Are there different mindsets that you encounter when people are used to firearms but using them in a different venue in the self-defense perspective?
So there is a difference in how the firearms are used, and there's a difference with who's around you when the firearms are used. Are you by yourself? Are you in a team? Are you going looking, not looking for trouble, but are you going to go move to contact in the military? Are you looking for suspects in response to a call for service or something that you saw in law enforcement? And in the civilian world, and I use the term decent, normal human being because I don't like getting into the whole civilian citizen argument, right? Just coming from the West Coast, that can be a bit problematic. But there, it's in response to somebody else's behavior, somebody else's actions, all right? So there's kind of those considerations, right? With the military, once you can get folks to understand that rules of engagement are different from constitutional use of force and self-defense, it makes life a lot easier. On the law enforcement side, it can flow back and forth between self-defense and constitutional use of force, depending on whether or not they're affecting an arrest or they're responding to the behavior of the bad guy. And on the decent, normal human side, they don't have to go look for bad guys. They don't have to go look in dark holes for scary people, right? They're dealing with what comes to them. So it's very much in response to the behavior.
You know, we read some stuff that you had written, and you used the term decent, normal human beings, and we were concerned, the three of us, that none of us might qualify, Eric.
Well, Sean, I don't know you. Don's a defense attorney, but I'll make an allowance for him. Steve.
That's spoken like a guy who was in law enforcement for 30 years, wasn't it, Don? Here's one thing we wanted to really drill in on today. We've been having kind of an ongoing discussion about defensive display as a viable, non-lethal alternative to actually firing the weapon and in self-defense. And we bring it up because one of the highest volume of calls, Don, I think you'll agree with this, that CCW Safe gets is people who get in trouble with brandishing charges, some sort of unlawful display.
That's right. That's right.
Right? And so we've been talking a little bit about the mindset difference and just the physical, tactical difference between brandishing and a defensive display. And Steve, you felt that Eric could contribute and move that conversation a little forward. Why don't you let us know why and kick this off for us?
Well, we had an excellent podcast with Greg Elfritz. It's been well received within my community about the use of defensive display. He talked about, primarily what he thought distinguished the two and whether or not if he answered a call where a person was using a weapon, whether or not he would actually go ahead, arrest the person or not. And we talked about it's always going to be better to not shoot somebody than shoot somebody, and it's better to not go to jail than it is to go to jail. And so there's, however, kind of an area here, and I think Eric can probably, clarify or elaborate on this, where people don't really understand what we're talking about. Okay, I understand that as a concept, like be aware. Okay, well then you have to tell, or I think you have to tell people how to be aware, or they're not going to be successful at it. in terms of using defensive display, okay, when can you use it and how should you use it so that you get the most positive outcome? And it's kind of the way that we were talking about. I think it's okay. Certain elements have to be in play: manifested intent, ability, opportunity, and really the absence of preclusion. Now I know there's stand your ground and castle doctrine laws, but in my opinion, I would still want to do anything I could to avoid shooting somebody, even though it might be lawfully justified. But there are going to be instances where a concealed carrier is able to get a little bit farther in the OODA loop, the observe, orient, decide, act, and respond to someone that's starting to exhibit pre-assault cues that shows, hey, I'm going to harm you or kill you, that allows you maybe to get ahead of that and stop them and make them rethink what they're about to do before they finally do that. And I attended, like I said, a lecture that Eric did at TACCON. I think that's about 2 years ago. Does that sound right?
It sounds
about 2 years
right.
ago you did that? Okay, when he was talking about, in great detail, had research on how using different ready positions at different angles had a significant impact on the outcome of that encounter, of that, potential lethal force encounter. And so I thought Eric would be just a awesome addition to this podcast, because he can target in on these specifics, and hopefully the viewer, whether it's a concealed carrier or armed homeowner, can say, okay, now I understand physically what I need to do in order to make sure that I don't end up in a situation that I wish I hadn't gotten involved in.
I'm going to default to California criminal law terms or penal code terms. Brandishing versus assault with a deadly weapon, right? Brandishing is the display of the firearm. Assault with a deadly weapon is when it's pointed at someone. If anything we can do to stop it from going to a shooting, right, regardless of what world it is in law enforcement or the civilian space, we should do, right? Like if you can leave. If not, right, at least we've done everything we can to try to minimize that. If getting the pistol out as the final precursor to a shooting can stop it, then I think everybody involved is going to be better off on it. The things that I have looked at on this are on the decision-making side and where the gun is in relation to getting enough visual information to make good decisions. In other words, not shooting somebody that doesn't need to be shot. So, and that's a couple of the research studies that I've looked at, and those are the ones I went back through before coming on today. So, Steve, I hope I'm going the right place for what you guys.
Yes, you are. Absolutely.
Okay. Yeah, I like that. So I'm interested in this decision-making side. We're talking about the armed defender's decision-making process on whether they decide the use of force is even possibly justified, and then if it is or may imminently be justified, what are their options in the little bit of time they have?
So one thing I want to hit on is on the research. There is not a lot of good research on decent, normal human being self-defense stuff. I finally saw the first study that incorporated that late last year, and it was comparing law enforcement to college students in the study. So there's some deficiencies there. The two I'm looking at are older. One of them was done, a gentleman by the name of Tom Avini, published back in 2008. It had to do with ambiguous shootings by law, or what they called ambiguous shootings by law enforcement. And the other one came from Paul Taylor at the University of Colorado, Denver. It was published in 2020, and it's titled Engineering Resilience into Split-Second Shoot, No Shoot Decisions, the Effect of Muzzle Positions. So, and if you guys want, I can send you those studies. They're out there in the public domain, and you guys can do with it.
Yeah, that'd be great.
The biggest issue, so like I sent you the photos of John Hearn, my stunningly attractive male model. Excuse me, little cough there. John's demonstrating the ready positions that were used in this study. And I will tell you, I wish they would have looked at a compressed high ready, where both hands are on the gun, the muzzle's elevated, but the people are looking over it. That's not addressed. And then what I consider to be closer to a true low ready that's not putting the muzzle on the bad guy at all was not looked at in it. So there's two things I would like to have seen some work on. What was included was position one was looking through the sights at the upper chest of the bad guy. Position two was looking over the pistol at the chest of the bad guy. The muzzle was lowered to about the sternum of the officer. The third position was muzzle lowered to about the navel or the belly button of the third officer, so we had a clear view of the bad guy. 313 officers were in the studies, and I can do a deep dive on the demographics if you want. But basically, I looked at about 140 instances where the role player who was on video pulled a firearm from their pants pocket. And there was about 170 instances where the officer was looking at them pulling a cell phone out of the pocket. The good news is every time the bad guy pulled a gun out of the pocket, they got shot.
Mm-hmm.
The bad news is what happens when the guy pulled a cell phone out of the pocket. Yeah, and that kind of gets into concern, right? And again, this is that split between the law enforcement world and folks who don't have to do that job is they're probably not going and confronting somebody and dealing with the behavior. They're dealing with a behavior that comes to them.
And let me just interject there, so I make sure our listeners are following along here. What we're talking about, and there's a concept that we've developed over the years, Eric, we call the armed defender's dilemma, that when, in most cases where we see an armed defender who is not the first aggressor encountering an attacker who's armed and they use their firearm to defend themselves, it's not a controversial case, right? Where we see the controversial cases where we see good, what do you call them? The normal, decent people, well-intentioned, decent, normal humans get in trouble is when they're facing probably a real aggressor who has intent to hurt them, but they're not armed, at least not with a firearm, and then they make these mistakes. And so what you described there with the cell phone, Don, that's what they might call in the court of law a furtive movement, right? If someone's making a gesture that could look threatening, but in fact turns out not to be because they're going for a cell phone or something.
Yeah, but of course, if you're going for a cell phone, you're clearly going for something, and that's the reason why it's so dangerous. You don't know what the person's going for, so you have to act as if you believe them going for a firearm and be prepared to deal with that scenario if indeed that's what happened. But of course, it happens so fast, they wind up, indeed, it turns out to be a cell phone, but it's too late. I guess, Eric, is that what you're saying? It's just too late at that point?
Yeah, so what happens is the higher the gun is in your eye line towards the target, the less visual input you get. So, got a blue gun right here. Okay, I don't know if you guys can see the color and everything. There's no muzzle. The magazine doesn't come out. It's a blue gun. And I'm going to point this at my camera. If I've got the pistol up here at the camera, right, and it's up at eye level, I lose a lot of visual input about what's going on the waist, what the hands are actually doing. So my reaction is to the movement, not what's in the hands, but to the movement. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
And the lower I can get that pistol, the more visual input I get, which means I'm able to see what's coming into play, not just the behaviors. Is that kind of process?
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. And so what we're trying to do here is we're balancing how much time we're giving ourselves to use deadly force once we are sure that it's justified, but we have to sacrifice a little bit of time to allow ourselves a better field of view to make a better assessment, right?
Yes. And the time is minimal, really minimal. So there were 3 hypotheses in Dr. Taylor's study. One was that muzzle position would not have an impact on decision making. The second was that the lower the starting muzzle position was, the better decisions they would make. And the third hypothesis was that the lower the starting position would be, let me go back to it, the slower the officers would be in responding to a legitimate deadly force threat, right? So 2 of those were proven legit. One was kind of tossed out the window. I'll hit on the speed part first because I know that's where a lot of the concern is. When the officers shot on the cell phone coming out versus a firearm, those shots were fired at between 0.51 and 0.55 seconds from the higher 2 ready positions. So right about a half second, almost indistinguishable. On the much rarer occasions when the officers fired a shot from position 3, the lowest of the 3 ready positions used, the shots were fired at 0.62 seconds. Now you can't measure what didn't happen, right? So like we don't know how long it took for the people to make the decision when they didn't shoot. We just know what the time was when they did shoot, right? But I will take that extra 11/100ths of a second or something in there to be right versus being fast and wrong. Does that make sense?
Yeah, we're talking about 1/10 of a second, basically, to give yourself the field of view
Yes.
to make a solid decision in a life or death situation.
Right.
Well, Sean, I might postulate this. As the other thing is that if I have my gun up here and I'm aimed at your chest, I don't have as much time to react to once I see your gun, because it's only got to go a few inches above that before I'm like, oh, I need to shoot. As opposed, if I'm down here, basically, it's still going to take that guy half a second, 3/4 of a second to bring the gun up. So now I think I have gained time to see that and then respond.
And Taylor talks about that in the study, right? That one of the things they looked at or they're considering was the longer it takes to come on target gives you longer to process the visual information, right? And to make the better decision.
Eric, let me clarify for myself, if I understand better, how these hypotheticals and scenarios were run. This started with a police officer with a gun out at some ready position.
Yes.
And a person perceived as the aggressor knowing that. Is that right? That they saw the officer, they saw the gun, they knew the officer had a gun in their direction and still went for something in their pocket, in their pants, whatever?
Kind of. So one of the things when you start looking at research studies, especially done in the academic world, is they have to be repeatable, right? So there's some variables that we would expect to see out on the street, the real world, right? That you won't see the variables and the variations in the study because everything's got to be the same for everyone. So these were videotape scenarios. Officers were given a dispatch, and Dr. Taylor's done some research into dispatch priming, which is the effect of what you're told going into the event and how it impacts you. And we know that folks go into events with some sort of pre-knowledge, right? So folks who might be around more violent crime or in places where there are more violent crime might be a little bit more prepared, if that's the right word, to respond to that, versus folks who don't live in an area with a lot of crime, who don't see it, and it's more like theoretical to them, are going to be slower. But the officers were given a dispatch. They were sent into a videotape scenario and encountered either the gun coming out or the cell phone coming out. But they were instructed to be in one of 3 ready positions: pointed in, muzzle at the sternum, muzzle at the navel, belly button for the scenario. So they were looking at a videotaped actor, not a real person, right?
Okay.
And so we don't have the variation of how a bad guy would respond to an officer in one of those 3 ready positions, right? They were just looking at the decision making and the visual input based on where the pistol was in the ready position. Does that clarify it, Don?
It does. Yes. And I think that's very valuable for our conversation and for people to understand the significance of that. I was just a little unclear as to how that might transfer or translate to a civilian who's dealing with an agitated driver, and they just both pulled over and both got out of their car and are now walking toward each other. Because that's the stuff that I see on a very regular basis. I can't believe how often I see that. Not only the road rage stuff, but those moments when both pull over and both get out of their car and have some expectation that something good will come out of it. So I'm seeing guys walking towards each other. One guy all of a sudden puts his hand on his gun, pulls the gun, holds it at low ready, and the other guy keeps coming. And then there's that moment, are they reaching for a cell phone? Are they reaching for a gun? And of course, there's the verbal stuff, the trash talk going on in between.
This is the way I bring this back into the armed defender's dilemma. Okay, what I'm concerned about is I have a person that is standing over there, and maybe he's 10, 15 feet away max, and he's holding a gun and he's pointing it at the ground. And I don't know if this guy's going to shoot me or not, but I'm concerned, and I believe that he may be here to shoot me. Do I want to just go ahead and shoot him right now, or do I want to see how this plays out? And do I have a plan in place and the skills in place to to bring us together and address that if he starts to move?
Let's make it real quick. Let's make it a real life scenario. I'm thinking about Daniel Perry in Austin.
Okay.
Right? He's got a guy in tactical gear with a assault rifle. Right? He's got the AK-47. He's approaching. So to use your matrix there, this guy has the ability and opportunity essentially to use this rifle if he chooses to. What Daniel Perry didn't know is what was his intent in this situation. So you're describing a scenario where I'm an armored defender. I have a contact who is clearly armed. So the first armed defender scenario we gave is we don't know if they're armed or not, but we did feel like they had the intent and the opportunity to hurt us. Now we've got somebody who has intent and opportunity, or but we don't know. They have ability, but we don't know what their intent is, and so we have to thread this needle here to not shoot too early, to risk being wrong, or not shoot too late and risk being dead.
Okay. Well, if I go back to Erick's study, if I am aimed in at this guy's chest, guess what? I cannot see. I can't see his hand down there. And so he can actually move that up until it's not into my line of sight, until it's actually above my front sight or my dot. Whereas instead, if I have this aimed at his feet, I can see that guy. When that starts to move, I can make my decision. I'm like, oh, this is a threat. And I can then engage this. And then, if you want to take this a step further, which I highly recommend, is, get a little bit of tactical training and, learn how to step off the line of attack while you bring your gun up, so you're not exactly where you were. You're no longer in the exact location you were when that guy shoots. So what I'm saying, Don, is this is a means when you have a potential threat that has the ability, which very well could be a gun, but he is not pointing at you right now.
Mm-hmm.
And this is something also that police officers find themselves involved in. And so, they're just at risk if they're aimed in on that guy and that guy's got that hand down there, because otherwise he can bring that up in, Erick, you can bring it up in a half a second, 3/4 a second, and fire a shot. And at sometimes these really close distances, you have a high probability of being struck somewhere.
So reaction time is going to be behind the decision-making time, right? If the bad guy decides to draw and shoot, you're going to be behind the curve because of processing, realizing what it is you have, beginning to respond to it and go. If we can back up a sec, take the study, whether you're applying it to cops or decent normal humans, and whatever happened on the highway has now gone to the parking lot of the Chevron gas station, right? And this is at the off-ramp nearest to my house, just as an example. So for whatever reason, we both pull in there, and I foolishly decide to get out of the car to deal with this guy. And this guy shoves a hand into a pocket or a hand into his waistband, and he's screaming this, that, or the other thing at me. And I draw my pistol. If I draw my pistol and go to a low ready where that muzzle's not covering him, I get to see from feet to eyes everything that's going on. And whatever he goes into his pocket or waistband for, as it starts to come out, I'm going to see the movement. But I also got a good chance to see what it is. I still have to respond to it, so all that time's going. Now take it to where I'm pointed in on his chest and I'm looking through the sights. I will only see the movement, right? And my decision will be based on the movement. And if the testimony later is he was pulling out his cell phone to film you when you shot him because you had the muzzle pointed in on his chest, right? And you didn't see what actually came out. That's where the issue is going to be, right? And that's trying to translate some of these studies that are very heavy on the LE side, and they're driven by issues about race and excessive force, right? And try to make them apply to the normal humans. And that's kind of the hard part, and the thing I've tried to do with taking some of this stuff and pushing it out into the public space.
So am I hearing you correctly that you may have just, as good a tactical advantage and actually a better tactical advantage by holding the gun at low ready and able
Yes.
to respond to what the actual threat turns out to be, as opposed to gun pointing it right
Yes.
at them. Well,
Yes.
I can tell you as a criminal defense lawyer, I would much rather defend somebody on an assault charge who had the gun at low ready than one who was pointing it directly at the chest of somebody. So it sounds like to me a win-win no matter what it turns out to be.
And that's done why I talked about, like, I use the California terms of brandishing an assault with a deadly weapon, right? I may draw to a low ready position, muzzle's not covering anything, and at worst it could be a brandishing issue. But if I draw and run muzzle across meat, for a cop that's now a reportable use of force in a lot of places, but it's also pointing a firearm at someone, and we get into the risk of assault with a deadly weapon, or however your state like titles it, terms it, right? I'd rather be dealing with misdemeanor brandishing than felony assault with a deadly weapon.
Yeah, that's a brilliant point, a really excellent point from a legal defense standpoint, because as you say, a lot of the brandishing or menacing, or in Florida it's called unlawful display of a firearm, that stuff is usually can be a throwaway charge of some sort in the larger picture, whereas aggravated assault with a firearm may carry a mandatory minimum sentence upon conviction. It's a much higher level of scrutiny by law enforcement, of course, by the DA, state attorney. Judges take that in a much different context and perspective than they do the, as you call, the sort of the nuisance brandishing or the misdemeanor brandishing stuff.
And I don't mean to minimize it. They're both violations, but one's a lot easier in the grand scheme of things to deal with than the felony assault charge.
I think that's even more important when you may be displaying a firearm in some way in response to even what you're perceiving at the time as a non-deadly force threat. You may not know what the threat is, but you know it's a threat. And of course, display of a firearm in many states is specifically by statute not considered the use of deadly force. So you're not having to deal with the display of the firearm as a response to a deadly force threat. You can do it for a lesser level of threat, and the less pointing involved, I think the better off you are in dealing with the legal system.
Yes.
And Eric, I think that's why you were frustrated that this study didn't include a lower ready position, right? I think you just gave me the title of this podcast when you said muzzle across meat. But if you were in a low ready where the muzzle of the pistol was pointing to the ground somewhere between you and their feet, now, depending on your jurisdiction, and I think just anywhere, it's going to seem like a less threatening behavior and less like aggravated assault, even if you don't use the firearm, than it is if you're pointing at them anywhere on their body.
And it may not appear, and this study doesn't look at what the perception of the bad guy, the perceived bad guy, right? We'll go air quotes, what their perception of the muzzle is in relation to them. But one of the gentlemen I teach with does a lot of expert witness testimony in the SWAT world and is a retired chief of police. And he's pointed out that it's the view of the other people present, right? And if they can see clearly that that muzzle's pointed at the ground between you and the bad guy, that's very different than them perceiving that the muzzle's pointed at the bad guy.
Yeah, well, and Don, so much of this comes down to what seems reasonable on the behavior of the armed offender, right? And if it is, you use the term, Eric, in one of these studies, ambiguous shootings. Right. We love on this podcast to talk about disambiguating the intentions of the perceived attacker. And if you can do that with a low ready where you're not pointing it at somebody, and they still proceed, now you have an opportunity to ratchet it up before using deadly force even.
So we can talk about that study, the ambiguous shooting ones. That was done by Tom Avini. It was at the request of a statewide municipal insurance consortium, right? They wanted to figure out ways to defend shootings that were perceived as being race-driven by law enforcement. And the overarching study was it was the nature of the call you were going to and the behavior of the bad guy was far more important than how they came out of the paint shop or the body shop. But two of the things out of that one that I like to point out to people's attention, that was done in 07, published in 08. And that was about 10 years into the whole active shooter response post Columbine. It was also several years into the global war on terror, and you started having veterans coming out teaching law enforcement and teaching the public. One of the things that Avini was concerned about in both of those was what he calls muzzle dominance positions. I would call them elevated muzzle positions, like pointed in on the chest or maybe on the sternum of the bad guy, and how that was influencing behavior with officers running muzzle too high. And if you look at Instagram and some of the other videos that are out there in the training world, regardless of where they are in social media, there's a lot of influence from some of the military organizations where they're not having to worry about criminal justice system issues about muzzles on people. And they're running with muzzles very high in the line of sight because they have a very different mission, a very different threat profile. And if folks are going off of that versus what can be an issue legally in the continental United States and the domestic world, right? If VD's concern even back then, now almost 20 years ago, was that too many people were running muzzles too high because of this influence.
That's interesting. As you're saying that, I've just thought about how many body cams I've seen from officer-involved shootings, and the body cam's often mounted right here, high in the chest, and when that gun's high, you can't see anything. But if the officer was holding it lower, then as the third party who's reviewing this after the fact, you can see more clearly that there was not a threat, and it usually works out better for the officer when you can see it.
And I will tell you in confession, I probably ran my muzzle across too many people for too often in my career, right? And it was only later on as I started to kind of see some of this stuff and started thinking about that, I realized I needed to get muzzle down low. But I'm not the only officer that was in that position. A lot of us did. And it's quite a topic of discussion in my peer group, mostly of retired cops looking back at this issue and seeing the decision-making side of it, seeing the information side of it, and trying to be more conscious about not pushing muzzle on meat, but getting people to where they're not muzzling individuals they're dealing with.
What we wanted to do is translate these studies to what a normal, decent human would do. And Don and Steve, weigh in here as you think, but what we're trying to communicate to folks is that what we don't want somebody to do is when they're facing a threat that they believe has the intent to hurt them, but they're unclear whether they're armed or not or how imminent that threat is, but they know they're armed and they're prepared to go to their firearm to protect themselves, but they don't want to make the mistake of waiting too late and getting hurt or killed themselves. And Steve, we talk about this all the time. If people don't train a lot and they're not confident with what that time is going to be for them to clear their concealed garment and pull that pistol out, they're apt to go to it sooner. And if they're going to it sooner under panic or duress, they're more likely to use it before they're authorized or justified in doing so, right? So what we're trying to do is build into folks' mindset that there's a in-between there, that they don't have to jump to firing this pistol. They can disambiguate this unknown contact, right, by if they feel justified. And Steve, at the beginning of this conversation, you threw out a lot of terms for our listeners about opportunity and intent and ability, right? But if those things are in place and one of those elements is ambiguous, then a low ready is a perfectly viable, less lethal option to shooting them. And all the studies that you've just told us, Eric, are telling us that keeping low will cost you a tenth of a second or maybe a little bit more if you're below their feet, reduce your legal jeopardy in your display, and actually, even though it adds a couple tenths of a second perhaps to your response time, gives you a tactical advantage. Is that right?
Yes. Yeah, that's a good summation of it. The thing I would say is make sure you plug working from a low ready position into your training, whether it's a muzzle depressed low ready, right, or you work from a compressed high ready. Okay, here where the muzzle would be up and over the head but out of your line of sight. Train for that. I see a tendency to focus too much on draws from concealment and the time on it versus drawing to a ready position and then working from there as in part of your training.
That's, I think, easier to do at the range. Wouldn't you agree, Steve? Like,
No,
like to no?
no, no. This is better done at, well, you want to do it, of course, from prying eyes. This is better done at home because all you really need to do there is basically go wherever you dry practice. You do dry practice. You have to
Right.
ask everybody that. Everybody goes, "Oh yeah, I dry practice," but that's really an important thing to be doing, and just practice your draw. Make sure there's no ammo in the room. Make sure your gun is clear. Pull it back, look in the chamber, look in the magazine well, rack it 3 times, make sure there's not something in there, and then basically you can just practice your draw right before a target, where basically it's just like, all right, clear my garment, hands on, drive it to low ready. All right, bring it up. You can alternate back and forth. But if you don't have that ability to have, I can do that, I know I have the confidence to do it, then you're probably going to be pretty tempted to get that gun out of the holster just as fast as you can because you're not confident in your skills, and then you get ahead of the situation and you find yourself as, okay, I drew my gun because I was just scared. But no, this is something, I mean, dry practice, that goes for practice shooting, or your draw can be done at home.
Well, and what I love about this too is if you get that mechanical practice going on, where you know with muscle memory that that low ready position is an option that you're familiar with, then that gives you a step in between going loud, Don. And we talk about from a legal analysis, right? If you're able to describe to law enforcement or through your lawyer probably the thought process that you went through every time that there's a threshold that was passed, then it potentially makes your actions more reasonable, right? And so if you know that you have got a space between holstered and pointing at some guy's chest and being ready to pull the trigger, then that creates a threshold that you can describe about your thought process. That they were approaching me, I was threatened by them. They said something to me that made me feel like they meant to hurt me. I went to low ready. I asked them to stay back, and they still approached. Then you made the next decision. Does that make sense? What I'm saying?
Yeah, I like to look at that as sort of a continuum of sorts, not necessarily how it might fit into a nice statutory scheme or language, but rather what the practical real world jeopardy seems to me. And that is, you can be charged with aggravated assault or gun pointing in some jurisdictions just by placing your hand on the butt of the firearm, even if it's still in the holster, even if it's still concealed. That doesn't prevent you from being prosecuted for aggravated assault or gun pointing, especially if that behavior act is coupled with some sort of threat. So the communication is, I have a gun, I'm willing to use it, all the way to the other end of it, which is directly pointing the barrel at somebody's chest. As a defense lawyer who has defended individuals charged with similar offenses on that entire spectrum of behaviors, it seems to me that the less actual gun pointing there is, even though you're charged with aggravated assault or gun pointing, the better off you are in the system because it demonstrates some kind of restraint, some sort of analysis and processing, and ultimately that will be to your favor. And I'm interested to know from Erick's standpoint, as law enforcement, did you try to dig into the specifics of the allegations if you were investigating an assault case? Did it matter to you whether the gun was actually pointed or just displayed or how it was held? Did that matter to you at the street level?
It did. A lot of my time was spent working gang suppression, so we were dealing with gang on gang violence a lot. But the times we had our clients, the citizens of the community, right, the residents of the community. We were trying to find out from them where they were, what they were doing, right? Not just was the gun in play, yes, no, and that being the decision, but what was going on with it.
Mm-hmm.
And just one thing to add on the Vini study, this kind of goes to something Steve was talking about. They looked at the agency that had the fewest number of mistake of fact shootings, and they looked at the agency that had the greatest number of mistake of fact shootings in the research. The agency with the greatest number of mistake of fact shootings had a very restrictive policy on when they could draw the gun, and they did almost no scenario training. And they were on the far side of 40% mistake of fact shootings. The one with the lowest had a very rigorous scenario training program where they put their officers in a lot of scenario decision-making judgmental situations, and they believe that was why they had the fewest number of mistake of fact shootings.
Since we're talking about the sort of types of defensive display and the value legally and tactically and such, I want to just illustrate that in the cases that I'm dealing with, which are typically fairly normal people, for the most part, dealing in their lives in fairly normal ways with each other, but something goes haywire, about a road rage incident, for example, and these otherwise conscientious, tax-paying, employed people just go crazy. They lose their minds and they wind up aggravating and escalating, and pretty soon they're getting out of the cars, as we talked about before, and facing off somewhere at the Chevron station. Well, it seems to me that neither of them are thinking clearly. Probably neither of them are trained enough, or they wouldn't be in that situation to start with. So now the way that you hold your gun, I think in large part, will impact their response. And I think, frankly, if you pull a gun and you hold it at your side or in front of you to communicate clearly that you are armed, that's very, very different in terms of how they may respond, in terms of how imminent they think that you are, the threat that you're posing to them, as opposed to drawing and pointing your gun at them and saying, back away, go away. I think in an untrained world, that's going to more likely provoke an immediate violent reaction because, the gun's pointing at you. What are you going to do? You are assuming at that point you're going to get shot, I think.
So what you're saying, Don, is that a good defensive display, as opposed to pointing a gun at someone, could actually protect the defender's life because the perceived attacker will interpret their intention differently. If it's a low ready, they're saying, okay, this person's just warning me, but if they're pointing it at me, then game on, it's happening.
It seems to me that act in and of itself may take defensive display to offensive display. Aggravated assault is you intend somebody, but without the intent to take their life, but you intend to put the fear of God in them, expecting them to be afraid, wanting them to be afraid. That's the whole purpose. So when you do that, you're going to get an often irrational, certainly unconsidered and ill-considered response.
Eric, in this work that we do, every self-defense shooting we look at has a lot of similarities, but they also have things that are so specific and unique to that particular encounter that it's impossible for us to give a scenario to folks that they can count on to be a guide to make decisions, right? There's no one way through this. There's a complicated decision tree that they have to go through. But I think what we've identified there's training and habits and behaviors that you can develop that will help you, that we know through studies or through experience are more likely to help produce a positive result than not. And to your point, when you were talking about this perceived road rage incidents where two people had the bad judgment to get out of a car at a gas station, right? We know that not getting out of the car is going to have a much higher probability of having a good outcome than getting out of the car. But when we're dealing with these studies, we're really fine-tuning our self-defense discipline, I think, knowing now that if a defensive display we feel is justified, that having it lower gives us more options and just proves the possibility we're going to have a positive outcome. And that's enough for me to incorporate that into my self-defense discipline.
Good summation, Sean.
All right. Awesome. Steve, do you have anything you wanted to add?
Oh, I just might throw in, and again, doing anything you can at the beginning that will help disambiguate the situation in terms of intent. So in a lot of instances, if indeed that person is closing in on you, if you simply start walking away, creating distance, I don't mean turning your back, but walking away, maybe at a kind of a semicircle, and say, hey man, I'm so sorry. If they continue to go, hey, I need you to stay back. And then finally, before you go ahead and draw, give a verbal challenge, stay back. And when you draw that gun, draw it very quickly to a low ready position. They refer to it at our precinct, or the precinct I was at, as hard guard. In many instances, you have caused that person to rethink their decisions and, think about maybe where the rest of their life is going to go. So having a plan, it's basically like having a script, and then understanding that, yeah, it may not survive first contact, but that at least there's something I can start doing. I think will probably, in many instances, turn out with a better outcome for, a lot of the armed offenders.
Doesn't the low ready also simply communicate, I'm able and capable of shooting you if I want to, but I haven't decided to do that yet. And that reinforces the notion that maybe they'll give their own actions a second thought before they force you in that position. Whereas if you're pointing a gun at them from the other, the other end of that barrel, they're thinking, this guy's already decided to shoot me. I better do something about that, or I'm going to stand here and get shot.
Yeah, Eric, you can tell the difference between somebody that's pretty unfamiliar with guns, trying to get one out of the holster into a low ready, and somebody that all of a sudden just snaps that thing out with authority.
And a lot of the research on this is more on the law enforcement side, right? But there are the extrapolations. But there are constant interviews with people on the other side of the law, folks who are doing significant time in the prison system, saying, I knew that dude was going to use a force on me and I wasn't going to win, so I gave up or I walked away from it. And I'm thinking of one very specific interview where a guy said that about one officer and turned around and said, but I shot the other guy on the next traffic stop because I knew that guy was not ready for me. Right, so there's some extrapolation where the bad guys know what they're looking at. Right, they know if you're willing to do it and you're capable, versus like the gun's a talisman, like it belongs in the sock drawer.
That's interesting. So if you're gonna put defensive display in your toolbox, it better look good, right, Steve? You have to appear competent, or else you're just telling this guy that you don't know what the hell you're doing.
Defensive display done right.
Maybe that's better than covering the meat for the title. Defensive display done right. Don, anything else for the good of the order while we got Eric with us?
No, this has been fascinating. I really love digging into this kind of stuff and seeing what the experts have learned and what they can teach us from their years of experience, and of course their exposure to a world far bigger than the one I live in. It's fascinating stuff. Thank you, Eric.
Well, Don, we see it from different sides, right? The stuff I saw my whole career was on the front end of it. You saw it on the aftermath, right? Like after everybody had a chance to cool down and some pages flipped on the calendar and everything was on paper.
Exactly.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
So we're still seeing the same thing, just different parts of it, different times. I always complained that there was no good research on some of this stuff until I went back to academia. Courtesy of your tax dollars, the GI Bill funded my research, right? And started to see where it was behind the academic wall. So what myself and a couple of friends have been trying to do is bring this out to the community, bring some of this material out.
If there's one thing for me to take away, and just the power of the assessment of this research and the conclusion that you are better off tactically, and I know as a lawyer you're better off legally by positioning the firearm at low ready than you are at pointing it at somebody's chest. I mean, that's what a beautiful outcome of that.
Yes.
And it's amazing how many people do not know that.
Yeah, it's amazing. Well, I mean, it's amazing that we've been recording podcasts together for years and years, and I learn something every time we do a new one. There's no end to the knowledge that you can gain to be more competent and safe and reliable armed defender.
Agreed.
Excellent, Eric. Any last thoughts?
No, thank you for having me. I appreciate it. I'm glad Steve reached out, and I enjoyed talking with you, Sean, and Don. Even if you are an attorney. No, I'm kidding. Right? I really enjoyed.
I had the good sense not to go to law school, Eric, but I get to do all the fun parts. Hey, Eric, do me a favor before we wrap up. Let our audience know how they can find out more about you and how they can train with you or be involved in what you do.
So my company is Cougar Mountain Solutions. Kind of have a niche of doing instructor development as well as end user training. The space that I occupy is defensive shotgun, pistol mounted optics, and low light. I do other classes with discussion if things are in my background and experience, but it's cougarmountainsolutions.com for a website, and you can find me on Facebook and Instagram. The company's named after the mountain on the backside of Sears Point and Finian Raceway in Northern California, where I used to live.
All right, everybody, that's the podcast for today. I appreciate you listening through to the end. I'm excited to announce that pretty soon we're going to be embarking on a 3-year podcast quest to bring you the 36 lessons for armed defenders. So stay tuned for that. Until then, be smart, stay safe, take care.
Run muzzle across meat